The time of the Renaissance in art was very fleeting. We talked about the great representatives of the Florentine school in the last block. Today we will visit Venice. One of the brightest representatives of the Venetian school is Lorenzo Lato. The artist's main subject was a religious theme, but there were other paintings as well. Alchemy and mysticism, symbols, mysteries and riddles that Renaissance people were partial to were reflected in the paintings of the artist. Venus and Cupid, 1520s. In this inimitable manner, Lorenzo Lato takes one of the most popular subjects of Venetian painting and gives it a witty and humorous touch in this unique masterpiece. The naughty Cupid urinates on his mother through a laurel wreath, an action meant to symbolize fertility. In readable ways, this is a wedding painting. It is inspired by ancient marriage poems. It is possible that the features of Venus may be taken from the bride. The details of the subject relate to both the goddess and marriage. The ivy symbolizes fidelity. Venus is wearing a wedding ornament on her head. The snake warns against jealousy. Another representative of the great Venetian is Titian, an invaluable contributor to the Venetian school of the Renaissance. Titian Vecellio became one of the most significant figures of 16th century painting. He favored mythological subjects. Titian often transferred events described in the Bible to the canvas. Madonna and Child, c. 1508. This religious painting is one of Titian's earliest works. Technical investigation has shown that the artist first placed the figures sitting directly in the center of the canvas, in a manner close to that of his teacher, Giovanni Bellini. The transparent cloth in which Mary places her son and the marble slab on which she sits encourage the viewer to reflect on the birth of Christ, as well as on his eventual fate. In 1517, the young Titian was awarded the title of the first artist of the Republic of Venice. The painter is inspired by the paintings of Michelangelo and Raphael. In his own works, he does not skimp on bright, saturated colors. And if in church subjects the artist is limited by conventions, the paintings on mythological themes allow to expand the horizons of creativity. Venus and the Luthier, ca. 1565-70. Venus, goddess of love, interrupts her composition of music to be crowned with a wreath of flowers by Cupid. A delighted, well-dressed young man playing the lute, a typical instrument for love madrigals, looks at her rapturously. In the background, nymphs and satyrs dance to the shepherd's music. Titian painted this love theme several times. This one remains unfinished, except for the landscape background, which was painted entirely by the artist. This subject will pass through the ages. The names of the beautiful women and their surroundings will change. But no matter what Titian's followers called their heroines, they always represent love, sensuality, and desire. Another love-themed subject is Venus and Adonis from the 1550s. Poetry on canvas. A scene from Ovid's Metamorphoses inspired Titian's work. Here, Venus tries to prevent her lover from going on a hunt, anticipating his doom. The mood of sensuality conveyed by the beautiful depiction of Venus, seen from the back, enhances the viewer's sense of the tragic end to this story, expressed through their exchange of glances and the frightened Cupid. Titian's studio made several versions of this composition, but this one is of exceptional quality and was painted by Titian himself. Art is a living and evolving thing, and just as we saw in Greek sculpture, the classics laid down by the founding fathers are refined by the next generation of artists. In the pursuit of visual elegance, as the Greek sculptor Lysippus once did, artists began to draw out the figures of sitters. Thus, a new trend in art emerged, Mannerism. the art of posing and a love of pretentious poses reached its peak. This unnatural, contrived pose a person adopts to draw attention to his originality, unusual inner world, and other qualities. We see the first signs of Mannerism as far back as Raphael and Michelangelo, but the following artists showed a greater manner. One of the brightest representatives of Italian Mannerism, Agnolo Bronzino, a remarkable Italian painter of the first half of the 16th century, portrayed this man many times. Portrait of a young man from the 1530s, painted in accordance with the strict requirements of court culture, the official parade appearance of the man. And if this painting by a master does not reflect Mannerism in its purest form, the same man in the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art will show you that. I will tell you about the hero of these paintings. It is an equally fascinating story. Lodovico Caponi Jr. was a representative of the golden youth of Florence. He came from a family of patricians and bankers. As befits a young man, he was partying and fighting with the husbands of their lovers. To calm his temper and conflicts, was sent then to Naples, then to Venice. Upon returning to Florence, madly in love with the beautiful and wealthy heiress, Maddalena, daughter of Bernardo Vittori. But the hand of the inviolable bride claimed all the rich, famous, and free men of Italy. Cosimo I de' Medici himself tried to marry his nephew. Ludovico was refused, though the love of the young man was mutual. Fleeing from the persecution and pressure of the Medici, Maddalena took refuge in a monastery, but at the demand of the all-powerful Duke, returned to the court in Florence. Ludovico sought the support of all the important nobles capable of influencing the Medici ban. Only by yielding to the request of Duke Alfonso II of Ferrara did Cosimo I consent to the marriage. The marriage was a happy one, and 6 children were born into it. Ludovico made a career, but his violent temper and constant scandals and lawsuits led him to an even excommunication, though he was later forgiven. He was a patron of the arts and literature. Such an extraordinary personality looks at us from the portraits of A. Bronzino. The most controversial representative of Mannerism, El Greco, a great artist born in Crete. He was brought up in the tradition of Byzantine canons, but dedicated his life and work to Spain. One can write about him endlessly. Let's explore his work with the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Christ Healing the Blind, c. 1570. El Greco painted this masterpiece of dramatic narrative either in Venice or in Rome, where he worked after leaving Crete in 1567 and before moving to Spain in 1576. It illustrates the gospel account of Christ healing the blind man by anointing his eyes. The 2 figures in the foreground may be the parents of the blind man. The upper left side of the composition is unfinished. The poses stand out for their grace. His Spanish work, on the other hand, reflects Mannerism in all its glory. The Vision of St. John, c. 1608-14. The painting is a fragment of a large altarpiece commissioned for the Church of St. John the Baptist Hospital in Toledo. It depicts a passage from the Bible describing the removal of the 5th seal at the end of time and the distribution of white garments. The missing upper part may have depicted the sacrificial lamb removing the 5th seal. The canvas became an iconic work for 20th century artists, and Picasso, who knew it in Paris, used it as inspirations for the Maidens of Avignon. And another work that is undoubtedly a masterpiece, View of Toledo, c. 1599-1600. In this landscape, El Greco depicts the city where he lived and worked most of his life. The painting belongs to the tradition of emblematic views of the city, rather than an accurate documentary description. It is very hard to understand now how such innovation was possible in the 17th century. An artist who destroys stereotypes and styles, even today, looks like an innovator. Let's give credit to the powers that be in the early 17th century for accepting, loving, and supporting the artist. His influence on the art of the second half of the 19th and 20th centuries is undeniable. A cultural phenomenon and large-scale direction in the development of art, the Renaissance, was a bright stage in the development of painting, architecture, and sculpture in 15th century Italy. At the end of the 15th and beginning of the 16th century Renaissance left the borders of Italy and began to develop in the territory of France and the countries of Northern Europe. Characteristic features are distinguished for the art of each country of this period. Renaissance was a starting point of social development and spiritual awakening. Two ways of transformation are distinguished: humanistic ideology and religious renewal. The second way was followed by the artists of the northern countries of Europe. The Northern Renaissance emerged in Germany and Holland. The main centers of development were Amsterdam, Augsburg, Halle, Nuremberg. The painting of northern countries is characterized by archaism, religiousness, symbolicism. The art has fewer connections with antiquity. The ideology is based on pantheism. There is a God, but he is embodied in nature, all spiritualized and non-spiritualized. Nature symbolizes connection with God, harmony, infinity. From this follows the desire of artists to convey nature through painting. So the landscape became a separate genre of painting. There are several fundamental differences that make it possible to distinguish the painting representing the Northern Renaissance. In the work of artists, the influence of Gothic, rather than ancient art, is more noticeable. Practically no attention is paid to human anatomical details. There is no connection with the ancient tradition, or it is minimal, detailed writing. Strong influence on the Reformation and the birth of Protestantism. The most enigmatic artist of this era is Hieronymus Bosch, a Dutch painter with a distinctive style and rendering of reality. The main feature of his work is allegorical. Bosch criticized the vices of society, showing negative episodes of life, was a moralizing artist. He combined sophisticated medieval fiction, grotesque demonic images born of boundless imagination with satirical folklore and moral trends, with unusual for the art of his era realistic innovations. Poetic landscape backgrounds, courageous observations of life, and the folk types and everyday scenes aptly captured by the artist Hieronymus Bosch prepared the ground for the formation of the Dutch genre of everyday life and landscape. The desire for irony and allegorical language, for the grotesque and satirical representation of a broad picture of folk life, contributed to the creative manner of Peter Bruegel, the Elder, and other artists. The Descent of Christ into Hell. A follower of Hieronymus Bosch, Netherlands, Bosch's scenes of the fiery inferno were extremely popular in 16th century Europe. The vast desert landscape with the burning city on the right and the river Styx on the left is the setting for this nightmarish vision in which Christ destroys the gates of hell in order to save the souls of the righteous. Pointing pleadingly, Adam and Eve kneel atop the ruined tower. Behind them, Old Testament figures ascend the winding staircase from the depths of hell. Among them, Abraham and Isaac with a sacrificial ram, and Noah with a model of an ark. One of the great representatives of the Dutch school is Peter Bruegel the Elder, painter and graphic artist. The main themes of his works were confrontation of good and evil, depiction of hidden meanings of pneumonia, madness and meaninglessness of human existence. Religious subjects are intertwined with everyday life. All his life he writes people simple, peasant people. Perhaps because of this fact, he was nicknamed Matiski. He does not set out to convey the accuracy of the characters, but he captures the general outline of the figure, its character. The Harvest, Peter Bruegel the Elder, 1565. There are 5 known Bruegel paintings devoted to the seasons, and one of them is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, The Harvest. This series reflects the medieval tradition of decorating calendars with images of human activities relating to a particular month of the year. The Harvest is thought to correspond to August. At the same time, it is already a purely Renaissance work, with the influence of Italian Renaissance painting, the richness of which Bruegel could see during his travels. However, everything he perceived was greatly revised, and his own Bruegelian perception of the world comes to the fore. None of his contemporaries created such landscapes and panoramic pictures of peasant labor. The scattered landscape, the golden sea of wheat, the village and yellow fields in the distance, extends into the misty haze to the distant lake. This space is inhabited by people who reap, knit sheaves, drive a huge cart of wheat, eat and sleep under a tree, and there, in the village, are also engaged in economic activities. Here, as in the other works of the cycle, it emphasizes the balance of nature and man, which can only be achieved by living a decent life. Peter Bruegel the Elder will prove to be the ancestor of an entire dynasty of artists. I present several works by his sons from the museum's collection. Next in the list of genius is Albrecht Dürer, the greatest German painter and engraver of lifetime world fame, an outstanding geometer and engineer fortifier, the founder of European watercolor, mechanic, architect, and art theorist. The artist combined the discoveries of the Italian Renaissance with the artistic traditions of Northern Europe. His works on canvas are in the museum's collection, but we'll talk about them in great detail in the portraits section. Today, we're going to talk about engravings. Thanks to Albrecht Dürer, engraving became one of the most popular arts of the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Woodcuts are a way of copying images that appeared in Europe in the early Middle Ages. The master leaves convex lines of the picture on a wooden board. It is called a stamp, and transfers the paint from the protruding parts on the paper, hence the name high engraving. Works made by this method turn out very expressive with clear lines, and the stamp itself is not difficult to make. Stamps for deep engraving were made of copper boards, and the master drew the lines with special chisels, files. The pressure exerted on the stamp was so strong that the paint flowed from the recesses onto the sheet. This technique allowed for the creation of more complex engravings with halftones and a play of light and shadow, but was much more labor-intensive. Dürer always chose subjects understandable to the average man, hiding a lot of secret meanings behind them, and at the same time leaving clues to help explain them. Melancholia I, 1514. One of the 3 great engravings of 1513 and 1514, known as his Majestätischer, Major Prince. Dürer's Melancholia is unparalleled in its concentration of symbols and its many meanings. In the 12th century, it came to be regarded as almost the most significant riddle given to mankind by art. Art historians and historians, culturologists and geographers, mathematicians and philosophers, astronomers and astrologers interpreted Dürer's engraving on the basis of their fields of knowledge. But it is also true that even before the viewer makes logical attempts to penetrate the meaning of the objects and decipher the secret message, he is already given in the feeling, to feel the tart bitterness, vicious heaviness, and Latin tenderness of Dürer's melancholy. Dürer himself commented sparingly on the engraving, but mentioned that the keys on Melancholia's belt were a symbol of power, and the purse at her feet was a symbol of wealth. Melancholia's head is adorned with a wreath of buttercups and watercress, folk remedies for dangerous bouts of deathly ennui. Behind the right shoulder of Melancholia's winged figure sits another character with wings, a little plump Cupid or a Rhoas. He is nestled above the book on the edge of a millstone, covered with a fringed cloth, that creates the necessary layer between the rough, cold surface of the stone and the warm skin of a child. And the subtlety of Duera's carving is such that he can feel all these texture and temperament movements quite vividly. The most important question here is, why is Erois dozing? He is not hovering playfully, as he is used to, nor is he looking out for a victim to be struck by his arrow. Obviously, this must mean that the earth desires and passions fall asleep in the state of melancholy that grips the artist. This, however, is true not only for the artist, but for any thinker and creator. When melancholy is present, the erotic attraction fades and modestly recedes into the background. Another work in the collection, The Night, Death and the Devil, is the earliest of the three prints. The protagonist is an armed warrior surrounded by the forces of darkness. On his right hand rides Death, an emaciated figure on a pale horse, and behind him comes the devil. There are many interpretations of this story. Sometimes the knight was seen as a representative of unclean forces, is associated with the young Erasmus of Rotterdam's treatise, The Christian Soldier's Manual. It is about a purposeful, fearless, and dedicated soldier, before whose will and steadfastness of spirit the forces of hell recede. Though the engraving contains no Christian symbols, Duerer's contemporaries saw the knight as a champion of the purity of the Church and a defender of Christian belief. He is accompanied by a dog, a symbol of truth, the devil, a symbol of temptation, and death with an hourglass as a reminder of the frailty of life. The level of sand in the clock suggests that the knight has time for a feat. At the same time, the hero of the engraving is also a hunter, and the oak leaves on the horse's head and tail, according to tradition, promise a successful return from the hunt. The tail of the fox on the rider's spear may be interpreted as his trophy. In general, researchers view this engraving as a symbol of vitality. Historically, Europe entered the era of Protestantism. In the 16th century, serious religious ferment began in Europe. The Protestant teachings of Luther and Calvin gained supporters not only in the ranks of the population, but also in the highest circles of European power. Gradually, entire countries left the Catholic Church, and if we consider that the Church remained the main customer of art, we need to remember the main differences between Protestant and Catholic theology in order to understand it. Followers of the Protestant Church go to churches and houses of worship where, unlike Catholic and Orthodox churches, there are no icons. Only images of the cross can be found. Protestants also lack the cult of the Virgin Mary, while Orthodox and Catholics venerate her. Neither do they pray to saints in the Protestant Church. In the Orthodox and Catholic churches, they are prayed to as intercessors before God. The next most prominent representative of the Northern Renaissance is the German painter Lucas Cranach the Elder. A supporter of the Reformation, he was a friend of Luther. The artist was involved in illustrating Protestant pamphlets, painted portraits of Luther on several occasions, and was also involved in financing the publication of the Bible. Luther translated it into German. That said, his painting is far from Reformation. He is called a true master of biblical and genre compositions, graphic and pictorial portraits. In his work, he was able to synthesize harmoniously the artistic principles of the Renaissance and Gothic traditions. The founder of the workshop of his name gave us a huge number of works in museums in many countries. There are also several paintings and engravings of the master in the collection of the Metropolitan. Venus and Cupid, c. 1525-27. Cranach often addressed the theme of Venus and Cupid, but this beautifully preserved panel is the only version in circular format. Flirtatiously playing with her veil and peering at the viewer, Venus ignores the agitated Cupid. His arrow is missing, suggesting that he was disarmed and powerless against his mother. The painting was most likely intended for display in a private atelier, and another painting in the same subject. For all his love of the Reformation, Subjects on the subject of saints were part of the artist's work for his customers. Maitre d'Armes of Saint Barbara, c. 1510. According to legend, Saint Barbara was executed by her pagan father Dioscorus when she refused to renounce her Christian faith. The four ominous witnesses may be the Roman authorities who first tortured her and later sentenced her to death. Among other things, Lucas Cranach was an excellent portrait painter, but we'll talk about that with you in the project section, Portrait.